Thank you very much, Christine, for your kind words of introduction. Good morning, gentlemen. Bonjour, collègues. E buongiorno a tutti gli stimati colleghi del Ticino, and also a very warm welcome to colleagues from near and far. I would like to welcome you to the second day of this conference. Today we will focus on fish migration, and in particular downstream fish migration through facilities at power stations. And I was asked to take the floor as the first speaker in the morning. I'm not an expert for fish or fish migration, but I would assume and I hope that many of you are experts in fish and fish migration, because this knowledge is urgently required because of many open issues and unsolved problems. But I'm not going to adhere to the fish perspective, but I will get closer from the point of the bird's eye view, because sometimes it's a good idea to move away a little bit and to, observe things from a distance. Well, what we're doing here is not a la polar exercise, because hydropower is the most important source of energy. 60% of the electricity is generated by hydropower plants, and if we take plants of 1 megawatt, we can actually say that 99% of the electricity is provided by these plants. So it's in particular the large power plants that are the backbone of electricity supply in Switzerland. And this applies in particular when we think of the fact that we're not going to import any nuclear power, and we will phase out nuclear power. So every kilowatt hour that is lost is too much. So as a matter of fact, hydropower is the trump card that we've got in Switzerland, and it is the key to sustainable energy. This is something that neighboring countries are sometimes envious about, and they will in particular. Let us not forget that hydropower is part of the solution and not part of the problem. But on the other hand, the variety of streams and the multiplicity of species is a richness that we would have to protect, also to the benefit of Homo sapiens. So we have to ensure that we will manage our natural resources in a sustainable manner. But this may not jeopardize the competitiveness of hydropower, so that electricity would have to be imported from other sources. Because we are seeing these problems in other areas. The operators and the agencies are very much committed to the search for solutions and implementation. Sometimes they find good solutions, as you can see it right here in Traunstein at River Aare. But you know that there are many rules and regulations that cover large areas. And as a matter of fact, hydropower providers are very often confronted with considerable problems. I'm not going to read the sections of the law, but I would like to underline what the problems are. Other interests have to be taken into account. This means, for example, energy supply for our country, where hydropower is very important. Protection against floods is also another subject that has to be taken into account. So other interests would also have to be taken into account. Then, of course, any measures that are taken must be economically feasible. The funding available since 2011 via grid fees is definitely a wise decision in order to make further progress. But we would have to take into account that this is no justification for wrong investments, and this only applies until the time when the license would expire. And we would also have to consider that not 100% of all costs are going to be covered, but that would be unacceptable. But these are more or less legal questions. It is quite clear that we need technically mature and appropriate solutions which reduce negative effects. But at the same time, we have to protect the most important source of sustainable energy in the Alpine region. So this is not only a challenge for power station operators, but for Switzerland as a whole. Of course, it is quite clear that free fish migration as such is a contradiction which can't be solved. We're trying to square the circle if we say that this is going to be feasible. Of course, although Rheinfelden is a very modern power plant, and measures have been taken, we must admit that we can only provide facilities that would alleviate the situation. Upward migration or upstream migration is a problem that has more or less been solved. Of course, we still need some further optimization and improvement, but all in all, we can say that it works. And a lot of facilities are very positive, but downstream migration through fish facilities is difficult. The fish follow the strongest flow in the river, and that means in a river towards the turbine or to other areas in case of a flood. But in the case of Kaplan and rotor turbines, we can say that the losses are relatively low. You will hear more about fish-friendly turbines in one of the other presentations. The question is whether the existing passability that may vary from plant to plant would not be sufficient. But in any case, we have to take into account the effect of the existing facilities to get an overall picture of fish migration. Another question, what migration for what species at what points in time do we want to support? If we consider the rivers of Switzerland, we've got 40 to 70 different species with different behavior and different preferences. So we need prioritization, taking into account target species, and those are probably those that would need further improvement with respect to passability, and this is being done in some cantons. Focusing on 3 or 4 important species, and this is something that is also driven by the US Americans, allows us to look for additional solutions, develop them and implement them if they are known, because we lack a lot of knowledge about the migration of fish in larger and smaller dimensions, and this is something that we have to be aware of. So we need some more basic research, and I'm quite sure that this is a challenge for many of you. In addition, the state of the art with respect to technical measures is also to be taken into account, in particular for large power plants. In smaller power plants, we've been using bypass facilities and screens, and they can be considered as state of the art. There's a power plant at the Riese, 0.4 megawatts, 9 cubic meters per second is the flow. And you will hear more about this facility later on. In the case of large power plants, these systems would not be appropriate. As a matter of fact, we have to take into account driftwood and other trash that would have to be removed. This is another power plant at the River Aare. Over many days, we had to remove the logs from the river. And it would also have to be considered that the dimensions are totally different for large power plants. A higher flow higher speed and different flow situations. This is another power plant at Augst, 32 megawatts, 750 megawatts per second. So this is quite a number. And of course, here we have the flood situation so that you can see the flow better. Fine screens wouldn't help at all. And as a matter of fact, that would even be counterproductive for fish. In view of the fact that this is so important for floods, we should warn you against any experiments. In the case of smaller facilities, you could do some, you could conduct some experiments. But as a matter of fact, the power plants themselves conducted a number of tests. There was a research project with the VAW and the EAVAC. And I can tell you that we're not going to have a Swiss knife that will provide all the solutions. We need good results at lab level. But we have to underline that more questions arose, and therefore we would have to consider what are the requirements for large power plants. First of all, it has to be proven that the measures are necessary and effective, also taking into account the investments. Target species must be defined. We need basic knowledge about the migratory behavior in order to take into account the proper migration. Availability of the power plants should not be limited, in particular taking into account difficult operational conditions, floods, or a lot of driftwood, etc. Third, we should avoid any energy losses, because every kilowatt hour that is lost has to be acquired elsewhere. And we have severe doubts that this could be done in an ecological way. Of course, we need appropriate investment costs and, if possible, low operating costs, taking into account the funding that is also provided by subsidies and the law. And, of course, we need to use a mature state-of-the-art technology, and this does not yet exist for large power plants. So let us try to combine sustainable energy provision with sustainability for fish species. We should, of course, improve the downstream migration facilities for fish in large power plants, which means that we must be able to make compromises. We've had a constructive dialogue between different stakeholders, as it is taking place today in the conference, makes me optimistic. I believe that we want to find measures that are not detrimental to hydropower and would also help biodiversity. I wish all of us the best of success, and I wish you an interesting day. Thank you very much for your time.